This is not audible. This recording is recorded with the intention of personal entertainment and opening dialogue for discussion of books. No copyright infringement intended. This is Crown of Midnight by Sarah J. Maas. Chapter 3. Selena sprinted through the darkness of the secret passageway, her breathing ragged. She glanced over her shoulder to find Cain grinning at her, his eyes like burning coals. No matter how fast she ran, his stalking gait easily kept him just behind her. After him flowed a wake of glowing green word marks, their strange shapes and symbols illuminating the ancient blocks of stone. And behind Cain, its long nails, scraping against the ground, lumbered the Ritterrack. Selena stumbled, but remained upright. Each step felt like she was wading through mud. She couldn't escape him. He would catch her eventually, and once the Ritterrack got a hold of her, she didn't dare glance again at those two big teeth that jutted out of its mouth or those fathomless eyes gleaming with the desire to devour her bit by bit. Cain chuckled, the sound grating on the stone walls. He was close now, close enough that his fingers raked against the nape of her neck. He whispered her name, her true name, and she screamed as he... Selena awoke with a gasp, clutching the eye of Elena. She scanned the room for denser shadows, for glowing word marks, for signs that the secret door was open behind the tapestry that concealed it. But there was only the crackling of the dying fire. Selena sank back into her pillows. It was just a nightmare. Cain and the Ritterrack were gone, and Elena wouldn't bother her again. It was over. Fleetfoot, sleeping under the many layers of blankets, put her head on Selena's stomach. Selena nestled down further, wrapping her arms around the dog as she closed her eyes. It was over. In the chill of the mists of early morning, Selena hurled the stick across the wide field of the game park. Fleetfoot took off through the pale grass like a bolt of golden lightning, so fast that Selena let out a low, appreciative whistle. Beside her, Nehemia clicked her tongue, her eyes on the swift hound. With Nehemia so busy winning over Queen Georgiana and gleaning information about the king's plans for Ilwe, dawn was usually the only time they could see each other. Did the king know that the princess was one of the spies he'd mentioned? He couldn't, or else he'd never trust Selena to be his champion, not when their friendship was widely known. Why Arthur Finn? Nehemia mused in Elwe, keeping her voice low. Selena had explained her latest mission, keeping the details brief. Fleetfoot reached the stick and trotted back to them, her long tail wagging. Even though she wasn't yet fully grown, the dog was already abnormally large. Dorian had never said what breed exactly. He suspected her mother had mated with. Given Fleetfoot's size, it could have been a wolfhound, or an actual wolf. Selena shrugged at Nehemia's question, stuffing her hands into the fur-lined pockets of her cloak. The king thinks... Well, he thinks that Archer is part of some secret movement against him, a movement here in Rifthold to get him off the throne. Surely no one would be that bold. The rebels hide out in the mountains and forests, in places where the local people can conceal and support them. Not here. Rifthold would be a death trap. Selena shrugged again, just as Fleetfoot returned and demanded the stick be thrown again. Apparently not. And apparently the king has a list of people whom he thinks are key players in the movements against him. And you're to kill them all? Nehemia's creamy, bound face paled slightly. One by one, Selena said, throwing the stick as far as she could into the misty field. Fleetfoot shot off, dried grass and the remnants of the last snowstorm crunching beneath her huge paws. He'll only reveal one name at a time. A bit dramatic, if you ask me, but apparently they're interfering with his plans. What plans? Nehemia said sharply. Selena frowned. I was hoping you might know. I don't. There was a tense pause. If you learn anything, Nehemia began. I'll see what I can do, Selena lied. She wasn't even sure if she truly wanted to know what the king was up to, let alone share that information with anyone else. It was selfish and stupid, perhaps, but she couldn't forget the warning the king had given the day that he had crowned her champion. If she stepped out of line, if she betrayed him, he'd kill Kael, and then Nehemia, and then the princess's family. And all of this, every death she faked, every lie she told, put them at risk. Nehemia shook her head, but didn't reply. Whenever the princess or Kael or even Dorian looked at her like that, It was almost too much to bear, but they had to believe the lies too, for their own safety. Nehemia began wringing her hands, and her eyes grew distant. Selina had seen that expression often in the past month. "If you're fretting for my sake, I'm not," Nehemia said. "You can take care of yourself." "Then what is it?" Selina's stomach clenched. If Nehemia talked more about the rebels, she didn't know how much of it she could take. Yes, she wanted to be free of the king, both as his champion and as a child of a conquered nation. But she wanted nothing to do with whatever plots were brewing in Rifthold, and whatever desperate hope the rebels still savored. To stand against the king would be nothing but folly. They'd all be destroyed. But, Nehemia said, numbers in the Calcula labor camp are swelling. Every day more and more Elwyn rebels arrive. Most consider it a miracle that they're still alive. After the soldiers butchered those 500 rebels, my people are afraid. Fleetfoot again returned, and it was Nehemia who took the stick from the dog's mouth and chucked it into the gray dawn. But the conditions in Calicola... She paused, probably recalling the 3 scars that raked down Selina's back, a permanent reminder of the cruelty of the salt mines of Endovir, and a reminder that even though she was free, thousands of people still toiled and died there. Calicola, the sister camp for Endovir, was rumored to be even worse. "The king will not meet with me," Nehemia said, now toying with one of her fine, slender braids. "I have asked him 3 times to discuss the conditions in Calicola, and each time he claims to be occupied. Apparently, he's too busy finding people for you to kill." Selina blushed at the harshness in Nehemia's tone. Fleetfoot returned again, but when Nehemia took the stick, the princess kept it in her hands. "I must do something, Elatinia," Nehemia said, using the name she'd given her on the night Selina admitted that she was an assassin. "I must find a way to help my people. When does gathering information become a stalemate? When do we act?" Selina swallowed hard. That word, act, scared her more than she'd like to admit. Worse than the word plans. Fleetfoot sat at their feet, tail wagging as she waited for the stick to be thrown. But when Selina said nothing, when she promised nothing, just as she always did when Nehemia spoke about these things, the princess dropped the stick on the ground and quietly walked back to the castle. Selina waited until Nehemia's footstep faded and let out a long breath. She was to meet Kale for their morning bun in a few minutes. But after that she was going into Rifthold. Let Archer wait until this afternoon. After all, the king had given her a month, and despite her own questions for Archer, she wanted to get off the castle grounds for a bit. She had blood money to burn. Chapter 4. Kale Westfall sprinted through the game park, Selina keeping pace beside him. The chill morning air was like shards of glass in his lungs. His breath clouded in front of him. They'd bundled up as best they could without weighing themselves down, mostly just layers of shirts and gloves. But even with sweat running down his body, Kale was freezing. Kale knew Selina was freezing too. Her nose was tipped with pink, color stood high on her cheeks, and her ears shone bright red. Noticing his stare, she flashed him a grin, the stunning turquoise eyes full of light. "Tired?" she teased. "I knew you weren't bothering with training while I was away." He let out a breathy chuckle. "You certainly didn't train while you were on your mission. This is the 2nd time this morning that I've had to slow my pace for you." A blatant lie. She kept up with him easily now, nimble as a stag bounding through the woods. Sometimes he found it immensely hard not to watch her, to watch the way she moved. "Keep telling yourself that," she said, and ran a little faster. He increased his speed, not wanting her to leave him behind. Servants had cleared a path through the snow blanketing the game park, but the ground was still icy and treacherous underfoot. He'd been realizing more and more recently how much he hated it when she left him behind. How he hated her setting off on those cursed missions and not contacting him for days or weeks. He didn't know how or when it had happened, but somehow he'd started caring whether she came back or not. And after all that they'd already endured together, kill Kane at the duel. Killed him to save her. Part of him didn't regret it, part of him would do it again in a heartbeat. But the other part still woke him up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat that felt too much like Kane's blood. She looked over at him. What's wrong? He fought the rising guilt. Keep your eyes on the path or you'll slip. For once she obeyed him. You want to talk about it? Yes, no. If there were anyone who could understand the guilt and rage he grappled with when he thought about how he'd killed Cain, it would be her. How often, he said in between breaths, do you think about the people you've killed? She whipped her gaze to him, then slowed. He didn't feel like stopping and might have kept running, but she grabbed his elbow and forced him to pause. Her lips formed a thin line. If you think passing judgment on me before I've had breakfast is in any way a good idea— No, he interrupted, panting hard. No, I didn't mean it like— He swallowed a few breaths. I wasn't judging. If he could just get his damn breath back, he could explain what he'd meant. Her eyes were as frozen as the park around him, but then she tilted her head to the side. Is this about Cain? Hearing her speak the name made him clench his jaw, but he managed a nod. The ice in her eyes melted completely. He hated the sympathy in her face, the understanding. He was the captain of the guard. He was bound to have killed someone at some point. He'd already seen and done enough in the name of the king. He'd fought men, hurt them. So he shouldn't be having these feelings, and especially shouldn't be telling her. There was a line between them, somewhere. He was fairly certain that he'd been towing it more and more these days. I'll never forget the people I've killed, she said. Her breath curled in the air between them. Even the ones I killed to survive. I still see their faces, still remember the exact blow it took to kill them. She looked to the skeletal trees. Some days it feels like another person did those things. And most of those lives I'm glad I ended. No matter the cause, though, it still takes away a little piece of you each time. So, no, I don't think I'll ever forget them. Her gaze found his again, and he nodded. But, Cale, she said, and tightened her grip on his arm, a grip he hadn't realized she'd still been holding. What happened with Cain? That wasn't an assassination or even cold-blooded murder. He tried to take a step back, but she held firm. What you did wasn't dishonorable, and I'm not just saying that because it was my life you were saving. She paused for a long moment. You will never forget killing Cain, she said at last, and when her eyes met his heart pounded so hard he could feel it across his whole body. But I will never forget what you did to save me, either. The urge to lean into her warmth was staggering. He made himself step back, away from the grip in her hand. Made himself nod again. There was a line between them. The king might not think twice about their friendship, but crossing that final line could be deadly for both of them. It could make the king question his loyalty, his position, everything. And if it ever came down to having to choose between his king and Selena, he prayed to the word that he'd never be faced with that decision. Staying firmly on this side of the line was the logical choice. The honorable one, too, since Dorian. He'd seen the way Dorian still looked at her. He wouldn't betray his friend like that. Well, Cale said with forced lightness, I suppose having Otterland's assassin in my debt could be useful. She gave him a bow. At your service. His smile was genuine this time. Come on, Captain, she said, starting into a slow jog. I'm hungry, and I don't feel like freezing my ass off out here anymore. He chuckled under his breath, and they ran through the park. When they finished their run, Selena's legs were wobbling, and her lungs were so raw from the cold and exertion that she thought they may be bleeding. They slowed to a brisk walk as they headed back to the toasty interior of the palace, and the giant breakfast that she was very much looking forward to devouring before going shopping. They entered the castle gardens, weaving their way through the gravel paths and towering hedges. She kept her hands tucked under her arms. Even with the gloves, her fingers were frozen stiff, and her ears positively ached. Perhaps she'd start wearing a scarf over her head, even if Cale would tease her mercilessly about it. She glanced sideways at her companion, who had peeled his outer layers of clothing to reveal the sweat-drenched shirt clinging to his body. They rounded a hedge, and Selena rolled her eyes when she saw what waited on the path ahead. Every morning, more and more ladies found excuses to be walking through the gardens just after dawn. At first, it had just been a few young women who'd taken one look at Kale in his sweaty, clean clothes and halted their walk. Selina could have sworn their eyes had bulged out of their heads and their tongues had rolled out onto the ground. Then the next morning, they'd appear along the path again, wearing even nicer dresses. The day after that, more girls showed up, and then several more, and now every direct route from the game park to the castle had at least one set of young women patrolling, waiting for him to walk by. "Oh, please," Selina hissed as they passed two women who looked up from their fur muffs to bat their eyelashes at him. They must have awoken before dawn to be dressed so finely. "What?" Kale asked, his brow rising. She didn't know whether he simply didn't notice or he didn't want to say anything, but "the gardens are rather busy for a winter morning," she said carefully. He shrugged. "Some people go a little stir-crazy being cooped up inside all winter." Or they just enjoy the sight of the captain of the guard and his muscles. But all she said was, "Right," then shut her mouth. No need to point it out if he was that oblivious, especially when some of the ladies were exceptionally pretty. "Are you going into Rifthold to spy on Archer today?" Kale asked softly when the path was mercifully clear of giggling, blushing girls. She nodded. "I want to get a sense of his schedule, so I'll probably trail him." "Why don't I help you?" "Because I don't need your help." She knew he'd probably interpret it as arrogance, and it partially was. But if he did get involved, then it would complicate things when it came time to smuggle Archer to safety. That is, after she got the truth out of him and learned what plans the king had in mind. "I know you don't need my help. I just thought you might want—" He trailed off, then shook his head, as if reprimanding himself. She found herself wanting to know what he'd been about to say, but it was best to let the topic drop. They rounded another hedge. The castle interior was so close. She almost groaned at the thought of that delicious warmth, but then, "Kale!" Dorian's voice cut through the crisp morning. She did groan then, a barely audible sound. Kale shot her a puzzled look before they turned to find Dorian striding towards them, a blond young man in tow. She'd never seen the youth, who was finely dressed and looked about Dorian's age, but Kale stiffened. The young man didn't seem like a threat, though she knew better than to underestimate anyone in a court like this. He wore only a dagger at his waist, and his pale face seemed rather jovial despite the morning chill. She found Dorian watching her with a half-smile, an amused gleam in his eyes that made her want to slap him. The prince then glanced at Kale and chuckled, and here I was, thinking that all the ladies were out so early for Roland and me. When all of them catch a vicious cold, I'll let their father know that you're to blame." Kale's cheeks colored ever so slightly, so he wasn't as ignorant of their morning audience as he'd led her to believe. "Lord Roland," he said tightly to Dorian's friend, and then bowed. The blond young man bowed back to Kale. "Captain Westfall." His voice was pleasant enough, but something in it made her pause. It wasn't amusement or arrogance or anger. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. "Allow me to introduce my cousin," Dorian said to her, clapping Roland on the shoulder. "Lord Roland Haviljard of Mea." He extended a hand to Selina. "Roland, this is Lillian. She works for my father." They still used her alias whenever she couldn't avoid running into members of the court, though most everyone knew to some degree that she was not in the palace for administrative nonsense or politics. "My pleasure," Roland said, bowing at the waist. "Are you newly arrived to court? I don't think I've seen you in years past." Just the way he spoke told her enough about his history with women. "I arrived this autumn," she said a bit quietly. Roland gave her a courtier's smile. "And what sort of work do you do for my uncle?" Dorian shifted on his feet, and Kale went very still, but Selina returned Roland's smile and said, "I bury the king's opponents where no one will ever find them." Roland, to her surprise, actually chuckled. She didn't dare look at Kale, whom she was certain would give her a tongue-lashing for it later. "I'd heard about the king's champion. I didn't think it would be so lovely." "What brings you to the castle, Roland?" the captain demanded. When Kale looked at her like that, she usually found herself running in the other direction. Roland smiled again. He smiled too much and too smoothly. His Majesty has offered me a position on his council. Kale's eyes snapped to Dorian, who gave him a shrug of confirmation. I arrived last night, and I am to start today. Kale smiled. If you could call it that, it was more like a flash of teeth. Yes, she'd most definitely be running if Kale looked at her like that. Dorian understood the look too and gave a deliberate chuckle. But before the prince could speak, Roland studied Selina further, a tad too intently. Perhaps you and I shall work with each other, Lillian. Your position intrigues me. She wouldn't mind working with him, but not in the way Roland meant. Her way would include a dagger, a shovel, and an unmarked grave. As if he could read her thoughts, Kale put a guiding hand on her back. We're late for breakfast, he said, bowing his head to Dorian and Roland. Congratulations on your appointment. He sounded like he'd swallowed rancid milk. As she let Kale lead her inside the castle, she realized she was in desperate need of a bath. But it had nothing to do with her sweaty clothes and everything to do with the oily grin roaming the eyes of Roland Havilyard. Dorian watched Selina and Kale disappear behind the hedges, the captain's hand still on the middle of her back. She did nothing to shake it off. An unexpected choice for your father to make, even with that competition, Roland mused beside him. Dorian checked his irritation before replying. He'd never particularly liked his cousin, whom he'd seen at least twice a year while growing up. Kale positively hated Roland, and whenever he came up in conversation, it was usually accompanied by phrases like conniving wretch and sniveling spoiled ass. At least that's what Kale had been roaring 3 years ago, after the captain had punched Roland so hard in the face the youth blacked out. But Roland had deserved it enough that it hadn't interfered with Kale's sterling reputation and later appointment to captain of the guard. If anything, it had improved Kale's standing among other guards and lesser nobles. If Dorian worked up the nerve, he'd ask his father what he'd been thinking when he'd appointed Roland to the council. Mia was a small yet prosperous coastal city in Otterland, but it held no real political power. It didn't even have a standing army, save for the city's sentries. Roland was his father's cousin's son. Perhaps the king felt that they needed more Havilyard blood in the council room. Still, Roland was untried and had always seemed more interested in girls than politics. Where did your father's champion come from? Roland asked, drawing Dorian's attention back to the present. Dorian turned towards the castle, heading for a different entrance than the one Kale and Selina had used. He still remembered the way they'd looked when he'd walked in on them embracing in her rooms after the duel 2 months ago. Lillian's story is hers to tell, Dorian lied. He just didn't feel like explaining the competition to his cousin. It was bad enough that his father had ordered him to take Roland on a walk this morning. The only bright spot had been seeing Selina so obviously contemplate ways to bury the young lord. Is she for your father's personal use, or do other councilmen also employ her? You've been here for less than a day, and you're already having enemies to dispatch, cousin? We're Havilyards, cousin. We'll always have enemies that need dispatching. Dorian frowned. It was true, though. Her contract is exclusively with my father. But if you feel threatened, then I can have Captain Westfall sign a— Oh, of course not. I was merely curious. Roland was a pain in the ass, and too aware of the effect his looks had and his Havilyard name had on women. But he was harmless, wasn't he? Dorian didn't know the answer, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to. Her salary as the king's champion was considerable, and Selina spent every last copper of it. Shoes, hats, tunics, dresses, jewelry, weapons, baubles for her hair, and books. Books, 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 and books. So many books that Philippa had to bring up another bookcase for her room. When Selina returned to her rooms that afternoon, lugging hat boxes, colorful bags of perfume and sweets, and brown paper parcels with the books she absolutely had to read immediately, she nearly dropped it all at the sight of Dorian Havilyard sitting in her foyer. Gods above, he said, taking in all her purchases. He didn't know the half of it. This was just what she could carry. More had been ordered, and more would be delivered soon. Well, he said as she dumped the bags on the table, nearly toppling into a heap of tissue paper and ribbons, at least you're not wearing that dreadful black today. She shot him a glare over her shoulder as she straightened. Today she was wearing a lilac and ivory gown, a little bright for the end of winter, but worn in the hope that spring would soon come. Plus, dressing nicely guaranteed her the best service in whatever store she visited. To her surprise, many of the shopkeepers remembered her from years ago and had bought her lie about being on a long journey to the southern continent. And to what do I owe this pleasure? She untied her white fur cloak, another gift to herself, and tossed it onto one of the chairs around the foyer table. Didn't I already see you this morning in the garden? Dorian remained seated, that familiar boyish grin on his face. Aren't friends allowed to visit each other more than once a day? She stared down at him. Being friends with Dorian wasn't something she was certain she could actually do. Not when he would always have that gleam in his sapphire eyes, and not when he was the son of the man who gripped her fate in his hands. But in the 2 months since she'd ended whatever had been between them, she'd often found herself missing him. Not the kissing and flirting, but just him. What do you want, Dorian? A glimmer of ire flashed across his face, and he stood. She had to tip her head back to look at him. You said you still wanted to be friends with me. His voice was low. She closed her eyes for a moment. I meant it. So, be my friend, he said, his tone lifting. Dine with me, play billiards with me, tell me what books you're reading or buying, he added with a wink at the direction of her parcels. Oh, she asked, forcing herself to give him a half smile. And you have so much time on your hands these days that you can spend hours with me again? Well, I have my usual flock of ladies to attend to, but I can always make time for you. She batted her eyelashes at him. I am truly honored. Actually, the thought of Dorian with other women made her want to shatter a window, but it wouldn't be fair to let him know that. She glanced at the clock on the small table beside the wall. I actually need to go back into Rifthold now, she said. It wasn't a lie. She still had a few hours of daylight left, enough time to survey Archer's elegant townhouse and start trailing him to get a sense of his usual whereabouts. Dorian nodded, his smile fading. Silence fell, interrupted only by the ticking of the clock on the table. She crossed her arms, remembering how he'd smelled, how his lips had tasted. But this distance between them, this horrible gap that spread every day, it was for the best. Dorian took a step closer, exposing his palm to her. Do you want me to fight for you? Is that it? No, she said quietly. I just want you to leave me alone. His eyes flickered with the words left unsaid. Selena stared at him, unmoving until he silently left. Alone in the foyer, Selena clenched and unclenched her fists, suddenly disgusted with all of the pretty packages on the table.